Taylor Parker is on death row tonight, hours after a Bowie County jury sentenced her to die for the murder of a New Boston mother and her unborn baby.
A heavy burden feels lifted. I feel like now we can start trying to heal. We don't have this over our heads. We know where she's going to be, we know where she's at, and she's taking care.
In today's episode, we'll be discussing the horrific case of Taylor Parker, a young mother from Texas who would do just about anything to keep her man from breaking up with her, even if that meant doing the unthinkable. Taylor Parker was a 29-year-old woman from Bowie County, Texas. She had been married twice, having a son with her first husband and a daughter with her second husband. However, both relationships were tumultuous and ultimately led to divorce. After her second divorce in 2019, Taylor was still on the hunt to find a loyal, loving man. In fact, she yearned for a family so badly and refused to give up on looking for love, even if things didn't work out within her previous relationships. Just a few months after her second divorce, Taylor met a man named Wade Griffin at a rodeo, the kind of place she frequented quite often. She fell head over heels for Wade, with those who knew Taylor stating that things between the couple got relatively hot and heavy at such a quick pace. Taylor was so into Wade that she'd even confided in him, letting him know that she was recently pregnant, but unfortunately had a miscarriage. Naturally, hearing this information caused Wade to feel sorry for Taylor. He could only imagine how significant of a loss that must have been for her. As their relationship progressed, Taylor started confiding in him even more, but some of her stories were a bit bizarre. For example, she told Wade she would inherit millions of dollars in oil and gas royalties. He wasn't so sure of this, but gave Taylor the benefit of the doubt and looked forward to the possibility of coming into a great deal of money in the future. At some point in their relationship, Taylor told Wade that her mother was an evil woman who put a hit on her. Claiming to be afraid for her life, Wade invited her to move in with him. Of course, Wade never could have expected the kind of drama he would get from Taylor after moving her into his home. Not only was she claiming that her mother put a hit out on her, but she'd also claimed that gang members were attempting to attack her when he wasn't home. One would think that this would set off some red flags for Wade. However, he seemed to ignore these red flags while staying in the relationship with Taylor, whose behavior only seemed to worsen. In fact, at this point, she was encouraging Wade to take out loans for cattle and telling him that it was no big deal because he'd be able to pay the loans off once she received the millions of dollars owed to her. In addition to encouraging reckless spending without actually having a way to pay back these loans, Taylor didn't have custody of either of her children at this point, which is usually cause for concern. After all, why wouldn't a mother have custody of her two children? Now, some believe Wade was ignoring the red flags because he hoped that Taylor would come into money and wasn't lying about receiving millions of dollars in oil and gas royalties. Those who knew both Taylor and Wade would agree that Taylor was more into him than he was into her. But he seemed to be excited about the endless possibilities of what he could do with such a large amount of money. One of those possibilities was a massive property by the Red River, a perfect spot for hunting, which was something that Wade loved to do. The property was listed for a staggering $4.7 million, but that certainly didn't stop Taylor from reaching out to the real estate agent to inquire about it. She even told the real estate agent that she was an heir to a syrup fortune and would be able to cover the cost of the property, so she put in an offer of $3.5 million and would put a deposit of $200,000 down to secure the property. Wade was so excited about this and looked forward to sharing the news with his family, all of whom enjoyed duck hunting and wanted to use the outdoor space for this recreational activity. While things seemed great initially, the happiness and excitement over the hunting property wouldn't last too long. Taylor claimed she'd have roughly $7 million wired to her bank account, yet that never happened. She eventually emailed the realtor and told him she couldn't complete the deal because her mother lied to her about her inheritance. She was basically blaming her mother for the fact that she didn't have the millions of dollars she claimed she would inherit. Of course, this entire ordeal caused a bit of a rift in Taylor and Wade's relationship, but soon, by March of 2020, Taylor would announce that she was pregnant with Wade's child. During this pregnancy announcement, Taylor let her friends and family know that she was due in September. While most appeared to be happy for her at this point, a close family friend of Wade, a woman named Angela, had her doubts. You see, Angela and Taylor had become quite good friends, and Taylor confided in Angela that she'd had a hysterectomy after giving birth to her second child. If that were true, it would mean there was simply no way Taylor could have a baby. Angela encouraged Taylor to take another pregnancy test just to verify if she was actually having a baby or not, but Taylor assured her that she was really pregnant. Angela had no choice but to believe Taylor when she began showing the family sonogram photos of the growing baby in her stomach. She even sent a pregnancy confirmation from a nurse to Angela, but Angela noticed that the nurse's name was on the confirmation, not Taylor's, which raised a red flag for her. When Angela mentioned this to Taylor, she naturally got defensive over the situation. Angela suggested going to a health center for a urine test, which Taylor agreed to. Keep in mind that this was happening during the pandemic, so Angela was unable to go into the clinic with Taylor. When Taylor came out of the clinic with a printed paper that confirmed her pregnancy, Angela believed it to be true. Moving forward, as Taylor's apparent pregnancy progressed, she and Wade decided to have a gender reveal where they shared that they were expecting a baby girl, whom they planned to name Clancy Gale. Taylor posted several photos of herself and her growing belly over the next several months and even purchased quite a few items for the baby. She also created a baby registry, encouraging her family and friends to buy items in preparation for her baby's arrival. When September finally rolled around, the month in which Taylor was due to give birth, things started to get real. Her ex, Tommy, who was the father of one of her children, reached out to Wade to explain that Taylor had a hysterectomy and was posting images of sonograms from her previous pregnancies while claiming that these sonograms were current. Taylor told Wade that Tommy was just jealous of their relationship and that he should ignore any correspondence from him. In the meantime, Taylor began building a strong friendship with another pregnant woman, Reagan Simmons Hancock. Taylor knew Reagan because she'd taken photographs of her wedding for her the previous year. Reagan had left a good review for Taylor's amateur photography business, and the two became friends on social media shortly after that. Once Taylor saw that Reagan was expecting her second child, a baby girl, she started talking to her more. In fact, Taylor even bought a gift for the baby and brought it over to Reagan's house. The two would spend the next several weeks texting back and forth quite regularly, discussing everything imaginable, including the joy and excitement they felt about giving birth. On September 30th, Taylor had an obstetrician appointment. She showed up for the appointment but cried the entire time and said she was upset because her husband had just died in the military. Obviously, this was a lie because Wade wasn't in the military and he wasn't dead. Of course, the medical staff was unaware of this, so she asked to reschedule this appointment, which the employees agreed to do. After leaving the clinic, Taylor sat outside for hours, watching pregnant women going to the clinic for their appointments. A few days later, on October 5th, Taylor still hadn't given birth. Now, this wasn't exceptionally out of the ordinary because many women don't give birth exactly on their due dates. It's not uncommon for women to need to be induced after a certain period. Unfortunately, on this day, a fire occurred in Wade's house, which destroyed the power and plumbing in the home. The fire department eventually discovered that the house was set on fire purposely, but they weren't sure who would do such a thing at this point in time. Shortly after the fire, Taylor told Wade's mom she was supposed to get induced that day, but that the induction had been canceled due to a bomb threat at the hospital. While the bomb threat was real, Wade's mother believed that Taylor was the one responsible for making the threat in the first place. In fact, she'd been doing some research on Taylor and her mother and quickly discovered that Taylor's mom was the one taking care of the two children she didn't have custody of. Wade's mother's comments to Taylor led to an argument between her and her son. Wade had taken off work for her pregnancy under FMLA, and his mother was concerned that he would get in trouble and potentially lose his job because she didn't believe Taylor was actually pregnant. She mentioned that it was best for him to go back to work and that if Taylor did have the baby, she would call him right away to let him know. She also insisted that there was simply no way for Taylor to be pregnant because she had a hysterectomy after the birth of her son, who just so happened to be 5 years old at this point. Nevertheless, Wade didn't take his mother's advice. He fell out of love with Taylor because he couldn't take the endless lies anymore, but he genuinely looked forward to being a father. He couldn't believe his mother would argue with him and doubt that Taylor was pregnant with his child. By October 8th, Taylor still hadn't given birth and decided to take a trip to Reagan's house for a visit. She brought over another gift and some Starbucks for Reagan, and the two hung out for hours. Taylor didn't leave Reagan's home until roughly 10 p.m. that night. The following day, Taylor was planning to get induced at the hospital. Before doing so, she put gas in her car and stopped at McDonald's for breakfast. A few hours later, a cop spotted Taylor driving recklessly on the road and decided to pull her over. When he stopped Taylor, he couldn't believe what he saw. Taylor was holding a newborn baby in her arms. An off-duty nurse stumbled upon the scene, got out of her vehicle, and offered to help. The nurse mentioned it would be best to cut Taylor's pants. Upon doing so, the placenta came out from her pants, and she was covered in blood. The officer noticed that despite having blood on her hands, face, and legs, the driver's seat didn't have blood on it. All the blood on Taylor looked as if it were old and dried out, which caused the officer to question what was really going on. However, the officer didn't ask about it at that moment because his concern was saving the baby's life. In the meantime, the off-duty nurse was giving the baby girl CPR, while Taylor cried hysterically. Taylor started to explain that she was shopping when she felt some pressure. After getting into her vehicle, she had a sudden urge to push, which is when the baby came out. She claimed that she was driving erratically to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. At this point, the officer had her get into the ambulance with the baby, where they would both be taken to the hospital for evaluation and medical care. Now, going back to when Taylor left her home in the morning and stopped at the local McDonald's, it was during this time that her friend Reagan received a text from a Google app number. At 8:30 a.m., Reagan's husband, Homer, started to receive texts from Reagan. These texts mentioned things like, "It's not working out." Homer became concerned because the text messages didn't sound like how his wife would talk to him. Shortly after receiving these messages, Reagan stopped responding. Nearly an hour later, Homer received a message via Facebook from a neighbor who noticed the couple's puppy was running around the neighborhood. The neighbor wanted to let Homer know that the dog got out. Now confused by the whole situation, Homer began calling Reagan back to back, but she wasn't answering. So, he contacted Reagan's mom and then decided to leave work and head home to see what was going on. By around 10:15 a.m., Reagan's mom arrived at the home that Reagan and Homer shared. She entered the property and came across one of the most gruesome scenes imaginable. Her daughter, who was 34 weeks pregnant, was lying face down on the ground with a pool of blood around her. She immediately called 911 to report the murder. She was completely hysterical and screaming, "There's so much blood everywhere." While Reagan's mom was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, her husband searched the home for Reagan's 3-year-old daughter, Kinley. He found her in a room by herself, alive and well. The local authorities arrived at the scene within minutes. They carefully moved Reagan's body over, only to discover that the baby in her womb was no longer there. Everyone was in complete shock. Reagan was severely stabbed throughout her body and had her stomach and uterus sliced open. Blood was in the living room, spread out on the floor, couch, and on a blanket. Smears and splatters of blood were on the doors and walls of the living room. While this was happening, Taylor was on the other side of town at the local hospital, where staff were trying to figure out what happened. Although Taylor stated that she didn't want a physical exam performed, medical professionals completed an exam on her out of concern and soon discovered that she didn't have a cervix. She also had no vaginal bleeding. Despite clearly being unable to carry a baby without a cervix, Taylor didn't let up. She continued to claim that she'd just given birth to the baby girl she was found holding while driving on the road. By 1 p.m., police in the area received information on Reagan's murder. They were all aware that this woman was pregnant and murdered, and that the baby was still missing and likely had been kidnapped. Just 1 hour later, the baby that Taylor was found holding was, sadly, pronounced dead due to a significant lack of oxygen. Now, putting two and two together, local authorities arrested Taylor at the hospital. She was then charged with capital murder for both Reagan and Braxlyn, the baby that Reagan was pregnant with at the time of her murder. During interviews with Taylor, she claims she'd gotten into an argument with Reagan and shoved her. She said that Reagan asked Taylor to remove the baby from her womb because she felt like she was dying. The detectives didn't believe Taylor's version of events, especially when she claimed that she didn't remember stabbing Reagan despite doing so multiple times. Taylor Parker would eventually go to trial for the murders of Reagan and her baby, where her many lies were unraveled, and those in attendance were able to finally learn the truth about Taylor. Not only was she a pathological liar, but she was also a cold, callous murderer. On November 9, 2022, it took the jury of 6 women and 6 men about 90 minutes to return with the verdict. Taylor Parker was sentenced to death for capital murder.